Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. February is always a great month here. For the last 10 years, we have been kicking the men out for the month of February and hosting incredible women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation from all over the world. So we have probably near 40 or more live events for classrooms this month. If you head to exploringbytheseat.com, you can find all of the events that we have coming up. It's only the second week of February, so there's still a lot to go. Now, the reason we do this is because February 11th, which is today, is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So to make things extra special, we have a full day event that's running from 9 in the morning till 3 p.m. Eastern. And we are teamed up with World Wildlife Fund, both in the United States and in Canada. And we have an amazing collection of speakers joining us. They are scientists, they are conservationists, they are researchers, they get out in the field. We're halfway through the day. We've had 3 incredible speakers already, sharing everything from mangroves and artificial intelligence to helping nature and people from space and looking at maps, which is what we are going to do kind of right now. We are going to spend a little time with Sarah Olimb. She's a Senior Geographic Information Systems Specialist at WWF-US. She makes maps and complete spatial analysis to support wildlife and habitat protection of the North American Great Plains ecosystem. So with us today, she's going to show us how maps and data collected are critical to conservation and monitoring wildlife species and places where they live. So I'm going to grab Sarah from backstage right now. Hey, Sarah, how are you?
Good morning, Joe. I'm great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, it's great to have you live with us. It's been a great day so far. You are kind of the peak, and then things go the other way because we in the back end of our 6 live events today. So it's awesome to have you with us. The Great Plains is an amazing ecosystem, and we're excited to dive into it with you.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, especially on International Day of Women and Girls in Science.
Okay, perfect. Well, just a shout out to our classrooms tuning in via YouTube. Don't be shy. Use the chat sidebar. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Send us in some questions anytime during today's event, and I'll work some in after Sarah's presentation. We'll also have a little Kahoot quiz today as well that your classes can join in, and I'll share the instructions for that after Sarah presents. All right, Sarah, we'll let you take over for a bit.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Well, it's so great to be here today, everyone. So thank you so much for joining. As Joe said, my name is Sarah Olimb, and I work for the World Wildlife Fund in the United States, and specifically for the Great Plains program. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about using maps and spatial data and as a way to work for wildlife and for conservation. So a little bit about me in my organization. That's my sports card on the left. As Joe said, I'm a Geographic Information Systems Specialist. So that's just a really fancy way of saying that I make a lot of maps and I deal with spatial data. I do remote sensing where I collect data from satellites and I use that to work on wildlife and conservation. My favorite animal is the manatee. And I really like science because I find that it's everywhere around us and it's in everything we do. And nature is both logical and beautiful. I'm really excited about my job and how I can use technology to protect landscapes and wildlife. And my biggest inspiration will always be nature because I'll never cease to be amazed by the beauty and complexity of the natural planet. I work for World Wildlife Fund. You might have seen the little panda that we have up on the screen. That's our emblem. WWF stands for World Wildlife Fund. And we're a really large conservation organization that works in almost 100 countries. We have millions of supporters, and we use science to conserve wildlife and wild places. And again, my job specifically is I'm a Geographic Information Systems Specialist, making maps and using satellite data. So why did I get interested in maps? I actually grew up in Georgia. I went to the University of Georgia. And the entire time when I was growing up, I didn't even think about maps. I always wanted to be a veterinarian because I loved animals. I went to school at UGA in Athens. And while I was there, I found an interest in wildlife. And I was very fortunate to be able to work on this little creature called the Allegheny wood rat. which is a type of pack rat that lives in the mountains of Virginia and West Virginia. And this kind of piqued my interest in wildlife and conservation. So after I graduated from college, I moved really far north to North Dakota, where I pursued my master's degree in biology. I'm still interested in wildlife, but while I was doing my master's, I started working in grasslands. And specifically here, I started looking at different species of beetles that lived in grasslands. So I put on my screen just a few of the hundreds of thousands of different species of beetles that you can find in this area. While I was doing my master's, I learned that maps are incredibly important to conservation, that you can go out and you can study wildlife and you can learn about natural places, but you need maps to show where these species exist on the ground, and you have to see how landscapes are interconnected. I also really loved maps because they both incorporated science, which I was interested in, and it was also really artistic, where I got to play with different colors and different fonts, and so it's something I was really interested in. So after getting my master's degree, I moved to Montana, where I got my job with WWF, and I've worked there for 16 years now. And I currently live in South Dakota, same job, still in the Great Plains. So in my job, I focus on the North American Great Plains, which is the center part of the continent. It's the grasslands that we've all heard about, that some of you probably live in or around. But it's the large landscape that stretches from Canada down through the United States, down into Mexico. Great Plains, full of grasses. And it's not just a flyover country, as you'll hear some people say, but it encompasses just an immense diversity of different species of grass, of plants, of wildlife. The main focus of my job is that I look at grassland and grassland conversion. So because we have to feed people in this country and around the world, we have to grow our foods. And one of the most fertile places in the continent, if not the world, to grow food is in the grasslands. So we lose a lot of grasslands, and we're still losing grasslands every year. The main ways that these disappear are to two main functions. One, they get plowed up to grow food, such as corn, soybeans, rice, all different types of food. And the other way that we're losing them is through something called woody encroachment. And the picture that you see on your screen on the bottom of the right, it shows how the trees are starting to move into areas that were once grasslands. And the reason this is happening is because in the past, we used to have huge fires that would sweep across the landscape every year, every few years. And this would kill off all the trees and would keep the landscape in grass. But more recently, with more people living in the area, we have stopped these large-scale fires. And because of that, we're seeing more trees moving into areas that were once grassland. Trees are great. They're just supposed to be in one place and not in other places. And so when they move into the grasslands, it takes away the habitat for the species which are supposed to live there. So I thought I'd show you just a picture of what grasslands, where they used to occur in the continent. So I work in the Great Plains, which is the big green section in the center of this map. But there used to be grasslands across a good part of the United States and North America. There were grasslands in California, in the western part of the US. There were even grasslands that covered almost all of the southeastern US. So if you live in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, where you live, there used to actually be native grasslands there. Now, compared to that previous map, this map shows where grasslands no longer exist. Everything that's shown in orange on this map is something that used to be a grassland that has now been converted to agriculture. So you can see that we have lost a lot of the grasslands that used to be on this continent. But one great thing about my job and the remaining grasslands is that I get to work with a bunch of amazing people and amazing species. So I just popped up a bunch of different pictures on your screen that show the different species, some of the different species that live in the Great Plains. And maybe you can identify some of them. But what I see are some black-tailed prairie dogs, some different species of grassland birds, a swift fox, which is a smaller relative of the red fox. There are pronghorn antelope that travel in great herds and migrate huge distances across the prairie. There are mountain lions, or pumas, as they're sometimes called, burrowing owls, which is a species of owl that lives underground in prairie dog burrows. We have bison or buffalo, which are huge herbivores that once existed in the tens of thousands and traveled in huge herds across the plains, eating the grasses and trampling the earth. They're prairie rattlesnakes. And then in the bottom right, there's a species called the black-footed ferret, which is a critically endangered species, maybe even the most endangered mammal in North America. And this species eats only black-tailed prairie dogs. And so all these species are interconnected. They depend on each other for survival. And more than anything, they depend on the grasslands. But how this ties back to my job. I have colleagues that go out and work on these different animals. They're out collecting data in the field on bison and where bison herds are being reestablished. And so my job is to take their data, their observations, and the data of our partners, and I make it spatial. I bring it back and I make it into a map. And this allows us to not only track how this species is doing, but it allows us to share this information with our partners who are working on the ground and with people who are interested in wildlife. So this first map that I'm showing you is about the American buffalo, the American bison, and it's showing how a small tribal reservation in Montana called Fort Peck Reservation, how they started sharing the bison that they produced on their lands with different places around the country so that these other tribal reservations and parks and other places so that they could reestablish their own bison herds. So you can see from this one little star in Montana, they've now reestablished bison in a dozen different places around the country and as far away as the Bronx Zoo in New York. So if you ever get a chance to visit the Bronx Zoo and you see some bison there, now you know that they came from Montana. Here's another map I made, and this one shows black-footed ferrets and how and where they exist in different tribal nations or native nations across the Great Plains. So as I mentioned before, the black-footed ferret is an incredibly endangered species. They actually thought that it went extinct at one point, and then a ranch dog in a little place called Meeteetse, Wyoming, came back to his ranch one day with a black-footed ferret in his mouth. And because of that, they discovered this one remaining population of ferrets. And from that one population, my colleagues and different partners around the region have been working really hard over the last decades to reestablish these ferrets. And so these different areas that you see highlighted in different colors on the map are showing where these ferret populations have been reestablished. So we've gone from a species that almost completely disappeared off the map to now where you can literally see it on the map in a dozen different places. It's still endangered. They're still working really hard, but the progress has been amazing. And using maps allows us to show not only geographically where these animals are, but also the numbers that have been reestablished and how they interact with other species. For example, the black-tailed prairie dogs that they depend on for their food and survival. And then I think I have this one last map to share with you. And this is a map showing migratory grassland birds. So one of the things that the Great Plains is known for is the incredible amount or number of different species of grassland birds. And there are 4 pictures of different species on your screen right now. And this is just 4 of hundreds. And these species are amazing because they're little tiny birds and most of them cannot survive the harsh winters that you're going to find up in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana. So these little tiny animals every year will spend their spring and summer up in the northern part of the United States. They'll eat food, they'll breed, but then when it starts to get colder, they migrate across the entire country down to warmer places in Texas and Mexico. And so through mapping and through using technology like GPS collars or GPS tags that we can put on these little tiny birds, we've been able to show how they migrate across the entire country. So starting in Montana and then going hundreds of miles down to places in Texas and Mexico. And using maps for this is really important because, one, it shows that we have to preserve habitat in both places. Yes, the grassland is really important in Montana, but it's also really important in Mexico. If you don't have both places, the species can't survive. And the other way that maps are really important is that when these species are making these long distance migrations, they're not just utilizing their start and end points. They have to stop and rest. These are hundreds of mile migrations that they're doing, and little tiny birds. And so they have to have what are called stopover sites in between Montana and Mexico. So it's critically important that we have little patches of grassland or little patches of habitat between these start and end points so that these species have a place to stop, that they have a place to rest, and they have a place to recover on their journey. And through mapping, we're able to ensure that these places still exist. And in areas that we're seeing that the species can no longer traverse these areas, we're identifying areas that can be restored back to grasslands or other types of habitat. And we're making sure that these migrations are still possible, and thus ensuring these animals' survival. So that's just a few examples of how maps are really important and how they can be used for wildlife. And with that, I will open it back to Joe, and I'm excited to take any questions that you have about Great Plains maps or anything at all revolving geographic information systems.
All right, Sarah, thanks for a great presentation. Really great to see that amazing biodiversity of grassland species and to see how you're using maps to help them, whether it's looking at their migration patterns, how they're distributed, how they're being reintroduced. Lots of different ways that we can use maps to help us in conservation. Very cool. Okay, well, I am going to tuck your presentation away, and we are going to, before we go to Q&A, we're going to have a little Kahoot quiz together with the classroom. So while you're presenting, I pulled together a few multiple choice, true and false questions, see how well our students were paying attention today. If you are tuning in via YouTube, don't be shy. Use the chat sidebar, send in some questions that way. I know we have Horizon Science Academy backstage with us as well. If you want to send some questions into the private chat, we'll work those in. But for now, let me share my screen and let's get that Kahoot going. All right. So how can you join in today? There's lots of different ways you could join in. The first way is to go to kahoot.it. If you go to kahoot.it, it is going to ask you for a PIN number. Today's PIN is 3971338. So if your classroom, if you're lucky enough to have Chromebooks or tablets that you can have at your seat, you could join that way. If not, your teacher could pop this up at the front of the classroom and you could shout your answers out to him or her. If you can't join via technology today, that's not a big deal. Lots of classrooms aren't able to. You can still work through the quiz and see how you do. So we'll give a few moments to get classrooms if they need to get their Kahoots out. There we go. We've got some starting to join. I have a couple questions in the chat already. So Sarah, while we wait for a few more groups to join us, I'm going to start with a question here from a group in Illinois. And they're wondering, you saw the maps and you mentioned that you work with a lot of other people, conservationists as well. So have you seen any creative ways to address the loss of grasslands that we're seeing right now?
Yes, absolutely. Creativity is an important part of science, I think. And that's a really great question because I think that that's how we see the most progress in things like grassland conservation. So some of the creative things that I've seen, one example would be that the species, the black-tailed prairie dogs, a lot of people don't like them on their land because they think, oh, they eat grass, they take grass away from our cattle, we don't want them there. But some of my colleagues recognized that when prairie dogs are present in an area, they actually make grass grow faster. And it's because when different types of vegetation like grass are disturbed, it actually causes a response in them that makes them come back quicker and stronger. And so by having prairie dogs in these areas, they were actually able to produce more biomass and actually make it so that these ranchers that live there could have more cattle on their land. And so that was a very creative approach to a problem that's been around for a long time. And it also showed how we aren't always at opposition with each other, that there are ways that we can work together and find a common ground. And sometimes we have to just think outside the box and realize that just because something's always been a problem doesn't mean it still has to be. And let's try and be creative, open our eyes, and just try something new.
All right, very cool. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds, and then we're going to go live with our Kahoot. Just to give you quick instructions again, true and false, multiple choice. If you put in the right answer, you're going to get points. The quicker you put the right answer in, the more points you're going to get. The faster you put the wrong answer in, the faster you'll get no points. So do take a second to read the question and don't just jump at the quickest one. And then we will see who comes out on top in today's Kahoot. So I think we are ready to get started. And I am going to, well, maybe I'll wait just a second. It seems a couple more groups are popping in. All right. I think we'll get it going. Here we go. I'm going to do a 3-second counting, so we want to make sure we have a nice chunk of time for Q&A. All right. First question coming your way is a multiple choice. Sarah at the beginning said her favorite animal was it the platypus, the manatee, the red squirrel, or the bald eagle? You do have a clue slowly decoding, a photo as well. And you've got about 9 seconds to lock in your answer. All right. Good job, crew. It absolutely is the manatee. Let's take a look at our scoreboard. The fearless dingo is in first place at the moment. Let's go to our next question. This is a true or false coming your way. Grasslands are one of the most fertile places to grow crops. Is that true or is that false? That grasslands are one of the most fertile places to grow crops. Got a couple more seconds on the clock. Oh, we had a bit of a split there, but it is absolutely true. And one of the reasons we're seeing grasslands disappearing as land is being used for growing crops, which of course is important for us, but takes away from those grassland ecosystems. Okay, let's take a look at our leaderboard. In the top spot, we've got the fearless dingo holding on. Another true or false coming your way. Fires are not an important part of the grassland ecosystem. True or false that fires are not an important part of the grassland ecosystem? Got about 13 seconds to lock in your answer. True or false? Whether grasslands are important. Fire to the grassland ecosystem. All right, there we go, crew. That's right. It is false. They're important. They're natural. They release a bunch of nutrients back into the soil. The grasses grow back nice and healthy. But as Sarah mentioned, the trees are able to encroach into the grasslands over time if those fires aren't allowed to burn. Okay, fearless dingo might be holding on tape to tape. We got one more question. Which animal wouldn't you find in a grassland? Is it the prairie dog, the swift fox, the spider monkey, or a bison? Which one would not turn up in a grassland? You've got a clue decoding on the screen, which should make it pretty apparent at this moment. And you've got 7 seconds to lock in that answer. All right. No fooling this, crew. Spider monkey is absolutely correct. Let's take a look at our podium, and then we're going to get into our Q&A action. So, the joyful squid holding down that third spot. In second, we've got the wise zebra. And holding down that top spot, we've got the fearless dingo held on tape to tape. All right. Good job, crew. Big shout out to the classrooms. Thanks for playing along with us. I'm going to turn off that screen share, so I should be back. And let's get into some more Q&A action. So like I said, don't be shy. I can see lots of classrooms tuning in via YouTube. Use that chat sidebar. If you're backstage, you can use the private chat as well. And we'll start off. I've got Cesar joining us from Nicaragua. And they would like to know if there's any dangerous plants or animals in the grassland ecosystem.
It's a great question. I guess it depends on how you would define dangerous, because you're going to find species that are plant species that are toxic anywhere in any biome across the world. And you're going to find animals that are venomous. So yes, those exist in the grassland as well. A really easy animal species would be the prairie rattlesnake, is a venomous type of snake. Is it going to hurt you? Probably not. They're not that aggressive. I never heard of anyone actually being bitten by one, and I don't really know many people that even see them. They tend to stick to themselves. With plants, just be careful. Just don't go around tasting everything that you see. That's usually a pretty good lesson anywhere that you are. And get guidebooks. Learn from people who live in that area. But in general, the Great Plains tends to be one of the safest places on the planet. You don't get the huge carnivores that you find in other landscapes. We don't have as many insects. There's not as many venomous spiders here as there are in other places. So yeah, I mean, dangerous? Probably not, but we still do have our share of exciting animals and plants.
All right. I've got a question from a 4th grade class wondering if when you're making the maps, do you ever get to spend time in the field?
I do. And that's actually one of the best parts of my job is that I have a standing invitation to go out with any of my colleagues in the field at any time. So for an example, with black-footed ferrets, they're a nocturnal species. And the way that you go and look at them is you go out at night and you travel around with lights and you shine them and you look for the green eye shine. And that's how you count where ferrets are. So that's exciting. It does mean that you have to stay up all night, which is fun for some people. I prefer to sleep, but once in a while it's okay. And there's also really exciting opportunities when, for example, bison are being reintroduced into lands where they historically were, but haven't been for hundreds of years. And so that's always a really emotional and exciting experience to be able to see these animals re-released onto the landscape where they once traversed hundreds of years ago, and to see them come back and to see the cycle being completed of species returning to the plains.
Okay. Another question here about the tools you use. What are some of the tools that are important for the maps that you make?
Okay, so yeah, making maps, it is definitely a tool-based system. And so we have a lot of specialized software that we use. There are different companies that make software. And it's almost like a video game in a way, where you get to point and click, you get to change colors, you get to move things around, you get to create things, you get to delete things, you get to see how things interact with one another. So all of these tools are built into the software. We also do a lot of coding, just like you do with video games, where you behind the scenes get to type in your code and you get to say, this is what I want my map to do. This is how I want this data to interact with this data. And so it's actually really fun. It's almost a game. And like I mentioned before, it's also really artistic because your output is really pretty. You get to create these beautiful maps that have lots of different colors, and you put animals on them, use different fonts. It's very fun to do.
All right. Our class in Illinois is wondering what you would say maybe is the most interesting animal or maybe project that you've had to create a map for.
Ooh, that's a really good question. I have to think about that. While I'm thinking, I will say that my favorite part of my job is that I get to work on so many different places and so many different species. So I'm mostly focused on the Great Plains, but also being part of World Wildlife Fund, I get to work with my colleagues around the globe. And so occasionally I get to make maps of Alaska or the Bering Strait or places in India or Nepal. And so that's exciting. But the most exciting animal that I've ever gotten to create a map of, I think I'll say the swift fox. And this is a tiny little fox. It's about half the size of a red fox. And it's incredibly shy, incredibly secretive. And it only lives in a few places in the plains. And I had the opportunity to work with some people who went out and collected data in the field, and we built what's called a connectivity map. So we were able to look at these little small pockets where this animal still existed and figured out ways to connect those habitats so that the populations could meet again, and that these isolated groups could meet back up and form new families and breed and have new generations. And that was exciting just because it's such a cute little animal, but also because in doing this, we were able to pave the way for this animal, the species survival in the future.
Okay. A 7th grade class here in Ontario is wondering if the maps you're making are more for the general public or for the researchers in the field. So maybe is there a balance between the two, or do you find you're making more kind of skewed towards one audience?
That's another great question. And the answer to that is I do both. And I love that about my job as well. On one end, I am full scientist with my scientist hat on, and it's very analytical and very high tech. And I'm working with data that comes directly from satellites, and it's incredibly complex. I love that. It's fun. I like doing science. On the other hand, I get to make maps that they publish in the World Wildlife Fund magazine that goes out to all of our supporters across the country and the world. And those maps aren't meant to be heavy on the science. They're more meant to connect people back to the landscape. So those are meant to be really simple, really plain, more visually interesting, but not as heavy on the scientific details. And so that's really exciting for me because I get to utilize both sides of my brain all the time, and it really keeps it exciting.
Okay. And so just to build on that question, how would your approach differ between the two? If you were, say, sitting down to work on something for the scientists to use with their data, or something that you wanted the general public to see, or a message or something?
That's a great question. And the most important thing is, number one, know your audience and know what you're trying to do. And so you always have to start with, what is my goal in this project? So if I'm working with a group of scientists, I need to know what do we need to come out of this? Do we need to identify areas on the ground that we're going to target for restoration of a species? Are we looking to identify where a problem is occurring, where grasslands are being lost? And then from that, I will work with the people who are experts in that area and work with the data, and you use all the appropriate tools and techniques that are available, using satellite data, using different forms of analysis. On the opposite end of that, if I'm doing something that's more for the general public, my end goal might be something like, we want to show where there are some iconic species in North America, just to get people reinterested in conservation. So there, we're not really concerned with where on the map exactly does this animal live. We're more interested in a broad sweep of where these animals could exist, and really connecting it back to things that the public is interested in. People are connected to their state, to their landscape. And so we might show animals in Nebraska and show how that's connected to the corn that's growing there, and the corn huskers, which is their football team. And we'll try and make those connections so that people have a visceral or a real connection back to the wildlife and the conservation. So yeah, I mean, it's a process, but the most important part is always know your audience before you start something, and always work really hard to define what your outcome is, so that everything that you do in that process is leading you towards success, so that you're working in a fashion that's going to give you the outcome that you need.
Okay. Before we continue with more kind of mapping questions, I do have a question. Students would really like to know what kind of fish you have in the tank behind you.
Yes, and the tank really needs to be cleaned, but I live in South Dakota and it's very cold, and so I don't want to take them out of there right now. They are some random tropical fish, and they're interesting because I have had them for about 8 years, and I don't think fish are even supposed to live that long. So either they are just amazing fish, or I just happen to be a really excellent fish caretaker because they just survive. But species-wise, I'm sorry, I have no idea.
That's okay. So we did have that spider monkey as an example that didn't live in the grasslands. So I think that's inspired Ms. Rivera's class to wonder if you've ever looked at animals or made maps for animals in the rainforest.
In the rainforest, I have. And the reason that I have is that when I was in college, I had the opportunity to do a study abroad, and I chose to go to Costa Rica. And so I had an opportunity through that to make some pretty simplistic maps of animals in the rainforest. Nothing that was groundbreaking or that was going to be published in any type of scientific journal, but just basically what animals exist and where across the different countries in Central America.
Okay. And a question here, this is from the 7th grade class again. Do you find that the mapping you're doing is climate change becoming more of a part of the mapping that you're doing?
Yes, that's a great question. And 100% yes. So climate change is having an impact on absolutely everything. It's changing where species can live. It's changing entire biomes. We're seeing grasslands shift from where they historically were. It's getting drier in parts of the south. So we're seeing the grasslands starting to move more north. Because of that, the species are moving with them. We're seeing changes in migration patterns. Some species aren't migrating how they historically did because they don't have to leave areas anymore. It's not as cold as it used to be. And the other thing that we're really seeing as a result of climate change is it's changing food production. And so we're now seeing that more crops can be grown in areas where they couldn't historically be grown, which is good in some ways, but also it means that it's now opening up places like grasslands that weren't under threat before, but now all of a sudden they are good for crop production. And so we're having to follow that trend and make sure that the expansion of agriculture is being done in a way that still balances with wildlife conservation.
Okay. And so with the work that you do, what's the most challenging thing? Maybe most challenging, or maybe the thing you like to get over with the quickest?
The most challenging thing that I have to do on a day-to-day basis is working with people who don't understand map making. And it's kind of funny, but people come with grand visions in their head, like, I want a map and I want to show this. And they really have no idea what they want or how to do it. And so it's always a challenge to try and take somebody's vision and to put it onto an actual physical map and to meet their needs and to try and accomplish what they want when it's not always possible. So kind of getting their expectations down a little bit sometimes, or showing them new paths that they may not have considered. But it's always a challenge because usually the first map you make is never the map that they wanted. And it could be something as simple as that I made something purple and they really like the color blue instead. So it's always a lot of back and forth and a lot of time. So I'd say that's challenging, but I've also learned to enjoy it a lot. And I've learned to understand my colleagues that I work with frequently better. And so kind of becoming a mind reader over time.
Okay. So what I think is great about the work that you do is it really brings art into science. And I know there's lots of students out there who, maybe science and math aren't their favorite subjects, but they love art. They love language and things like that. So what advice would you give to a student who's, maybe interested in the wild world? Art is kind of something that they really enjoy. What advice would you give them if they were interested in a career similar to yours?
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. And I think now more than ever, we're realizing that just because you don't consider yourself a mathematician or a scientist, that doesn't mean that you can't have a career in things like wildlife or conservation. Just art alone, there's so many different paths that you can take to contribute to wildlife conservation. Just as an example, there's natural history. There's still the need for drawings of these different species out when people are out in the field and they find something new. Yes, we have amazing photography now, but it's also really important to have an artist's perspective on that. Diagramming different processes and patterns in conservation, that's incredibly artistic and doesn't require necessarily a strong scientific base. And so these skills are really needed as well. So as far as advice, I would say that don't pigeonhole yourself, and recognize that if there's something that you're interested in or multiple things that you're interested in, there is a job out there for you. So if you're interested in art and you like wildlife, then find a job in wildlife that allows you to use your art. as I kind of mentioned earlier, when I was growing up, I didn't realize that my job was a job, and I was just really lucky to find it. And it meets both my love of science and my love of art. And so it ended up being perfect for me. And I think there are a lot of careers like that. So, don't decide now what you want to do. Like, go out and take different classes and expose yourself, have different experiences. And sometimes you'll just find something you're really passionate about.
All right. Great advice, Sarah. And I think a perfect spot to say a huge shout out to our classrooms. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for playing Kahoot, sending in those great questions. Shout out to the classrooms who will be watching this recording over the next few days as well. And then, Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today, for sharing your expertise, talking a little bit about why it's so important that maps are incorporated into conservation, and being a great representative of what today is all about is celebrating amazing women in science, exploration, conservation all over the world. It was great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you all for participating and for all the really wonderful questions. I enjoyed this so much.
Excellent. Well, we are going to go live in about 15 minutes, and we're going to be talking backyard bio with Elizabeth. So if you can join us, hang around our channel and we'll go live then. For now, Sarah, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your week. And we're going to sign off for now. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.